Okay, so in our last video, we talked about demand, and in this one, we're going to talk about supply. And a lot of these things are going to seem really, really similar. We're going to use very similar examples, and a lot of it is going to feel like the same thing that we talked about in the last video. But in the last video, we talked about demand. We talked about the law of demand, which says if price increases, then quantity demanded decreases, or if price decreases, quantity demanded increases. We learned about why the demand curve is sloped downward because there is a negative or an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. We learned what shifts demand curves, and we talked about why the demand curve is inverted when it comes to real income effect, substitution effect, and the law of diminishing marginal utility. So we're going to take that information and now we're going to apply it to supply. So tomorrow, or in our next video, we will put supply and demand together on one graph. But in this one, we're working with just supply. And you're going to get a little bit ahead of me because you're going to know when we talk about some of this stuff that supply and demand don't really work independently of each other. We have to talk about them independently of each other just so that we understand them. But they're going to interact in a market. And again, a market is an economy in which the people and the businesses, private citizens, individuals, decide what gets made, how it gets made, and for whom it gets made, without any government interference except to protect their private property rights. So from here, let's get into supply a little bit. So where demand was the relationship between price and the quantity demanded, supply is the relationship between price, let's get my correct pen, price and quantity supplied. So the price, we know the dollar amount in US dollars for us, what it will cost you in terms of price. And then the quantity supplied is how many are firms or businesses willing to sell at each price. So where demand is talking about buyers, supply is talking about producers and or sellers. Okay, so here we have a supply schedule for bicycles. I want for you to take this time to graph the chart. We want to make sure we're graphing correctly and accurately. So you will use your graph paper and you will work in the first quadrant only. So those are your axes. On your y-axis, again, this is different from math. On your y-axis, you will have price, which is our left-hand column. And on our x-axis, we will have quantity. Y goes on the price. Price goes on the y-axis because y is the price so high. That's how we're going to remember this. You are going to label your graph the exact same way you did when you did your demand column. So you will label by 10s or 20s from $140 up to $300 up here at the top of your y-axis. It's not very pretty. And then you will label quantities either by ones or twos, however you see best fit, from 1 to 17. All right, so again, in economics, different than math, instead of going over and up, we go up and over. So you'll go 140 to 1, 160 to 4. And at this point, pause the video and graph your supply schedule. Okay, what you should have graphed is a supply curve that is upward sloping like this. Take this time now to label an S on the top right-hand side of your supply curve. So your graph should be much prettier than mine is. You should have your y-axis labeled P for price, your x-axis labeled Q for quantity, an upward sloping supply curve with an S at the top of it to indicate that this is supply. From this point, we can talk about the law of supply, which says the higher the price, the higher the quantity supplied. In other words, the higher the price, the more people that want to sell that product, the more people will want to produce. Okay. Now, you're probably thinking, well, people won't buy it if it's that high. But remember, we're going through supply and demand independently of each other right now. So we're not worried about the demand. We're not worried about if people will buy it. We're just worried about if you'll supply it. So the idea here is if you could sell something for $1 million, you would, and everybody else would want to as well. So the higher the price, the more people would want to sell. And the lower the price, the fewer that people will want to sell. So these are positively related because price and quantity supplied go in the same direction. They both go up together and they both go down together. So when price goes up, quantity supplied also goes up. When price goes down, quantity supplied also goes down. All right, so this is kind of what we just said. If you can earn more money from a bicycle, you will want to sell more bicycles. So the supply curve shifts upward in a positive direction because they are positively related to each other. And the reason that they are positively related is because the law of diminishing marginal returns. If you add factors of production over and over again, your output is going to increase at a diminishing rate. What that means is if you have an acre of land and you have your land, you have labor, somebody working on that land, you have capital, which would be a rake, a shovel, a tractor, whatever, we'll say a tractor, and you're the entrepreneur and you're working that land. If you continue to add workers, but you don't add capital for those workers to work on or more land for them to work on, one more person may be more productive. Two more people may be more productive, but not as productive as the one before them. But you're not going to hire 45 people to work on a small plot of land because then you've got too many workers working on it and they're not going to increase your output. It's the reason that you only have that businesses only hire a certain amount of workers, or the reason that they only have a certain number of drink machines. So if you think about going to Zaxby's, they only have 2 drink machines. They have one behind the counter and one for people to work in. They don't have another one because they're not going to get the same rate of output from that piece of capital as they did the second one. All right, just like demand, when you draw your supply curve, we're assuming ceteris paribus, that everything else stays equal, and that price is what makes the supply curve slope upwards. However, the supply curve can shift right if there's more supply and left if there's less supply. So our mantra that we're going to keep repeating to ourselves is left is less, left is less. Make sure that you say right and left instead of up and down, because if you say up and down, especially with a supply curve, it gets confusing with the way that they're drawn. So when we draw that supply curve, we assume ceteris paribus, it's upward sloping, and if the price changes, we'll move along that supply curve. But if something else besides price changes, then our curve will shift to the right if there's an increase and to the left if there's a decrease. So at this point, you're going to assume that there's some sort of new technology that's available to increase the supply of bicycles by $1 million bicycles at each price point. So let's go back to our chart where we were looking at the supply schedule. And we're going to assume that there's 1 million more at each price point. So now at $140, there are 2 bicycles. And at $160, there are 5 million bicycles. And at $180, there are 8 million bicycles, and so forth. So at this point, I want for you to graph on the same graph your new points on your supply curve. So pause now and graph. What you should have drawn is a second supply curve that we're now going to label S2. That's our second supply curve. So label your supply curve S2. And if you have space, I know again your graph is it's kind of small, really tiny, but if you can draw arrows in there to the right, we're going to do that. The reason that we don't say supply goes up is because that would look like this, and that's incorrect. That would be actually to the left, okay? So we always want to make sure that we say that it shifts to the right rather than it goes up. You'll make that mistake. I'll correct you. Every once in a while, I'll make that mistake. You'll correct me and we'll be okay. But we want to make sure that we try to always say shift to the right and shift to the left. If we were to shift this curve to the left, let's say there had been a million less at each price point, then we would have had 3 and 6 and 8, etc. And we would have had a new supply curve here, and that would have been to the left of our original supply curve. Okay, so what are the things that are going to shift a supply curve? Well, the first thing that can shift the supply curve is new technology. So if we have technology that will increase the amount that is produced, technology would be capital. And it could also be part of human capital, physical or human capital. It can shift to the right if there is an increase in technology. We've already seen where technology can shift our production possibilities curve to the right. So investment in technology generally will make our economy grow. The price of goods used in production. So if we're making bicycles and the price of steel, I don't know that they use steel in bicycles, but whatever material they're making bicycles out of these days. It's been a long time since I've been on a bicycle, but the price of that product, if it decreases, then the firm that makes the bicycles, when they're buying the resources to produce the bicycles, they can buy more resources and create more bicycles. So if the price of the resources decreases, the supply will shift to the right because you can make more bicycles. And let's say that a lot more people want to make bicycles. For instance, let's think about stationary bicycles. All of a sudden, Peloton came along, and now there are all these off brands of Peloton. There are all these new businesses that are creating these stationary bikes. There's all these more firms in the market that has shifted the supply of those bicycles to the right. We've also got the expectation of future prices. If you expect that the price of goods you use in production will increase in the future, you'll buy more now and produce more now. So expectations are always going to play a role, and we'll talk more about this when we get into aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and where those products go when they make them before they sell them, and how they go into our economy. An important thing, even in a market economy or in a mixed economy, is going to be government taxes and government regulations. So if the government taxes the bicycle producer a lot, then a lot of their money is going to have to go to pay taxes, and they're going to be able to produce less bicycles. So their supply would shift to the left. The other thing could be government regulations about where people can ride bikes, or if they're going to build bike lanes and things like that. And so if the government regulates bike use, then the supply curve, I shouldn't say that. That would be demand. Let's pause on that for a moment. Okay, so if the government is regulating the way that you interact virtually through these Pelotons, or they regulate the materials that bikes are made out of, then people are going to produce less bicycles. If they give subsidies, a subsidy is, I call it a gift of money to a business. A subsidy is when our government gives a business money to help them compete in the market. And so if the government were to give a subsidy to bicycle producers, then they would obviously produce more bicycles. So supply curves can shift due to these things. All right, so remember, a movement along the curve, that means from one point on a curve to another point on a curve, only happens when the price changes. Okay, so the price will change the quantity supplied, and that is a movement along the curve. A shift in the curve is due to anything but the price changing. So movement along the curve is when price changes. A shift is when anything except the price changes. Hope that helps you with supply. And make sure you're answering the questions based on the PowerPoint and you're turning those into me. And tomorrow we will put supply and demand together and learn how we create equilibrium prices and equilibrium quantities.